Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Written Page podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. I'm talking to you from the small town of Martin in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. It's a very hot afternoon here in Tennessee, around 92 degrees or so. But, well, you know, it's June, and it's just about that time of year. Perfect time to be inside and to record a new episode of the Written Page, which will be available on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. And today I am really excited to have a conversation with the author of a book that I have read not too long ago. The title of the book is Charlatan, America's Most Dangerous Huckster, the Man Who Pursued Him and the Age of Flim Flam. And the author of this book is Pope Brock, who is joining us from Arlington, Massachusetts. Hello,
I am
Pope.
indeed. Hello, Anton. How are you?
It's great to be here, and I appreciate your having accepted my invitation to participate on this edition of the Written Page.
Of course, I'm glad to do it.
This book, Pope, is a book that I really enjoyed reading. You have written other books. You have written for Esquire, for Rolling Stone, for other publications. But at some point, you became interested in the life and the activities of a very strange person, very intelligent person as well, and a not very honest person, which was Dr. John R. Brinkley, going back to the 1920s, 1930s. Tell us a little about how writing a book about John R. Brinkley came about.
Well, I was actually coasting around on a website called the Museum of Hoaxes, which, incidentally, I recommend to anyone who has some spare time on their hands and mischief in their hearts. It's a great sort of catch-all of all kinds of chicanery through the years. And I just ran across this guy's name on a list. And it was his name, John R. Brinkley, and then to the right, one line, just a few words. It said something like goat gland testicles million-watt radio station. And I said, okay, well, who can this possibly be? So I pulled a string on that, and then this whole wonderful circus unfolded.
That's quite interesting because something like that sort of happened to me as well. I was already familiar with the name of John R. Brinkley because of my interest in two things. First of all, music, and second of all, the history of the early years of broadcasting in America, which is, you know, the beginnings of broadcasting, whether it be TV or radio, is something that has always interested me. And a few years ago, I found this book by Gene Fowler and Bill Crawford called Border Radio, and it talks basically about the border stations. And one of these border stations, in fact, the very first chapter in this book is about John R. Brinkley, who was a doctor, as you already mentioned. Well, sort of a doctor.
A doctor, yes.
Back in the 1920s, and he started performing these goat gland operations, which were supposed to rejuvenate people, in this case men, but not only men, also women in some cases. What did you find attractive about the story, the very, in many ways, unbelievable story of John Brinkley?
Oh, well, first there was just the flat-out bizarre central premise that he would cook up this idea of implanting goat testicles into impotent men as you said, as a way to rejuvenate them. Not that he ever thought it would actually work, but it was just a shining testament to what people will fall for, you know, and particularly impotent men being one of the large populations of, you know, psychologically vulnerable people. And probably dumber than women when it comes down to it. He made a fortune. He made millions of dollars doing this over a number of years, 10, 12 years. Millions in 1920s dollars. He had more business than he knew what to do with. So if it had just been that, I would have been interested, and it would have been worth, an article. It became a book when I realized that this was just the platform he used to create this whole empire, and that he was, in fact, as kind of psychopathic as he was in some ways, because he was not above killing people, along the way, on the table. He was a pioneer, a really important pioneer in media and advertising. The border blaster thing, as you mentioned, he was the first guy to do that, to go across the Rio Grande into Mexico, and put up this giant radio tower, 1,000,000 watts. And he did it to get away from the AMA. But it started this whole huge, this gigantic popular culture wave. Other stations got set up, and, before you know it, you've got Wolfman Jack down there. So, he was just this amazing character that people had kind of kicked dirt over through the years, I think because he was so, nefarious and unsavory, but he had a really big impact on popular culture.
Now, a goat gland operation, that really sounds like something completely out of the blue. It really does. When you think about it from a 21st century perspective, it's at least surprising that Dr. Brinkley came up with this scheme. How did that happen? How did it occur to him that he could make tons of money off of goat gland operations to rejuvenate men who were not performing as they should?
Well, there was context for this. There was research going on primarily in Europe, but also in Chicago. There were other places where people were experimenting with the idea that implanting monkey glands into the body could prolong life, invigorate people. That monkeys, being theoretically so close to human beings in makeup, that you stick in and look at monkeys, right? How they hop around from tree to tree. That it could really be really beneficial. Now, this was sincere research. People, these pioneers, so they thought, out on the cutting edge of this, they believed in what they were doing. They hoped that they were right, and in some cases, they deluded themselves into believing they were right. Brinkley picked up, he picked this up in the air like anybody else, but he didn't jump right into goats. The catalytic moment was when a farmer, he was in this, they were in this little town in the middle of Kansas, and this farmer came in and said, I can't get it up. Help me. And Brinkley said, I can't help you. There's nothing to do for that. And the story goes, and the gist of the story, I think, is true. The farmer looks out the window. He looks at the goats out there in the field. Like, I wish I had goat nuts. And an idea was born. Now, whether, but that's what got it started. That was the bingo moment, and Brinkley did it. He did this thing. I mean, when I say transplant, there was no actual transplant. He just cut him open, tossed in the goat nuts, sewed him up, and sent him on his way. This farmer, Stitsworth, survived the operation, which was a plus, healed up, and then apparently because of the mental boost that this gave to him. If there's anything that virility is prey to and prone to, it's psychological suggestion, which is part of what makes it such a perfect field for quackery, right? In any event, this guy comes back sometime later, 9, 12 months, and he has a baby boy. And then this gets in the paper, and and Brinkley's off to the races.
When he was thinking about this idea of rejuvenation, he was picking up on the work of other doctors like Serge Voronov or
Yes.
Eugene Steinak over in Europe. But you also say in the book something that's really interesting. To put this into some good context, this happened just at the end or around the end of World War One.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
How does World War One feature into this situation?
Well, for one thing, World War One decimated the male population of the West. Very much in Europe, not so much in America, but there was a sort of general. Looking back, it's not something that's sort of carried forward in the textbooks, I guess. But the fact is that the men who were left, older men in some cases, felt this kind of imperative to replenish the race. Mm-hmm. So that's part of what fueled the research. Like, how are we going to, get these guys to go in for, one more go, whatever it is. So that was part of it. It yoked to the jazz age and sexual freedom in a way they complemented each other. So those were a couple of the vectors the social vectors that helped give the thing a boost.
You're listening to the voice of Pope Brock, joining us from Arlington, Massachusetts. He's the author of Charlatan, a book about Dr. John R. Brinkley, published a few years back, but I have read it recently and have really enjoyed it, so it's really my pleasure to have Pope on the show today. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and this is a new episode of The Written Page. Now, Pope, there are other books that have been written about Brinkley, but none are as detailed as this one. There was even one entitled Life of a Man that was commissioned by Brinkley himself in the 1930s. How did you go about doing the research for this book? Was it an easy task? Was it difficult? Did you encounter any difficulties as you were doing this research? Did you encounter any difficulties along the way? What was the process like?
Well, I began to gather information about it, and that's how any project like this really begins. You just gather things, like a squirrel. You're just sort of pulling all things together. It's all very kind of fun, and you're not worried about the organization or exactly. You're just sort of playing in it. I realized at a certain point that one of the reasons that Brinkley had not been better publicized or more written about, because he was written about a bit, but not a great deal, is that he's a very problematic character for a straight biography, because because psychologically, although he was incredibly inventive and so on, we were saying, and he had this outre kind of life, mentally, psychologically, he was something of a psychopath, as I say, sort of closed down in very important ways, which makes him very hard for a reader to identify with. That is what biography thrives on, I think, is that the reader imagines her way into the person that they're reading about. It's hard to do with him in depth. You keep bouncing up against, oh my God, look at that behavior. So I was stalled at a certain point. I realized this is going to be a little harder than I thought. It was when I realized that this other doctor, real doctor, named Dr. Morris Fishbein with the American Medical Association, had set out to bring Brinkley down, and that this was a campaign that went on over 15 or 20 years. Then I realized I had a story. I had a chase, basically. Like like Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. I had a story, and then I knew I had a book, and I think that's what kind of propelled the whole thing forward. There's nothing like action for revealing character, anyway.
Morris Fishbein, Dr. Fishbein, was the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association back in those days, in the 1920s, and for a long period of time, really. And he was a self-designated quack buster. As we can see when we read your book, he wasn't only going after Brinkley, but he was going after many other quacks that appeared around the same time. Of course, Brinkley was of paramount importance for Fishbein. Why did Fishbein have such an obsession with dismantling the empire that Brinkley built?
Well, Brinkley was the most, he was the wealthiest, the most notorious, the biggest nose thumber of the bunch. He was far and away the most successful. So that put him right in the middle of the sun, right there. It was the combination of his success and his arrogance and his being on the radio. I mean, before he set up the Border Blaster, he had a big station in Kansas, one of the very first, and so he was broadcasting all over half the country and achieving a notoriety in that regard that no other quack had. So he was a famous man. Brinkley was, at his peak, he was the most famous doctor in the United States. So he became, the obvious central target for Fishbein to go after, sort of his Moby Dick. But because Brinkley was so nimble and inventive, and because he gathered so many supporters around him, he was very, very hard to bring down. Also, because if I can just add, because the AMA at that time, when Morris Fishbein was, beginning his crusade, had far, far, far less power than it does today. It was really trying to set up shop, and had not yet. It didn't have the kind of iron grip that it does today.
Now, John R. Brinkley, and the R is actually Romulus Brinkley. It stands for Romulus. John R. Brinkley was born in North Carolina in the 1880s, and actually not too far away from Asheville, North Carolina, which is a part of the country that I know pretty well. But that was not where he started his operations. His first hospital and his first radio station, KFKB, were built in a town in Kansas called Milford that most people may not have heard about. In fact, I had never heard of that town until hearing about Brinkley. Was there any specific reason why he opened his first station and his first hospital in the middle of Kansas?
Well, first of all, about Milford, no one should feel bad about not having heard of it, in part because it was tiny at its best, and it's been at the bottom of Reservoir for about 30 years, so you can't go there now anyway. But Brinkley, he had crept out of a diploma mill and he was scuffling. He'd been thrown out of the army as a malingerer. He was never. He was looking for a slot. He was looking for a way in, and he came upon an ad in the paper. Milford needed this town. Milford needed a doctor. So he and his wife, they get in their Model T, whatever, they go puttering up to it. It turns out to be much smaller than he realized, than he had thought it was. But they stuck around and just had a very shabby life at first. He was at 6s and 7s. He didn't know quite what to do. It was the goat gland idea that transformed his life.
He didn't really have a real medical degree, or did he?
Well, he had something he could put on the wall. It was, as I said, a diploma mill in that you didn't necessarily have to have a great many more skills coming out than you did going in. Diploma mills were fairly ubiquitous back then. But anyway, he had something on the wall. It had this scrolled lettering. It looked like a diploma. These things were much. It's like being a Kentucky colonel. You can just call yourself, and it works in the world. Later, in later years, he went on and he pretended to accumulate a great number of degrees. I couldn't possibly recite them now, but I remember that in the prologue, the book, that first scene, he has maybe 20 letters strung out after his name. All these other bogus degrees that he had bought. So he was extremely degree conscious, even if he wasn't, education conscious.
He even had an honorary degree from the University of Pavia in Italy that Maurice Fishman made sure that Mussolini himself struck out and made invalid.
Yes, that's right. But that's how far he would go. He'd go overseas and he'd come back and say, "Look at this fantastic degree I got from this ancient Italian institution that graduated Columbus," or whatever it was.
Now, the reason why I was asking that, why I bring that up, is that the title of your book is Charlatan, and reading the book, one wonders if Brinkley, at least in his own mind, and it's hard to get into Brinkley's mind. Of course, he was gone way before you or I were born. But one wonders if, in his mind, at some point, he got to believe the things that he actually talked about. This idea that maybe he was aware that you can't really fool all the people all the time, but if he was able to fool himself into believing that he really was a doctor, then it would be a lot easier to fool people who were not educated into believing that what he was saying was right and was true, and he would be able to cure them of all those diseases.
I think you're right to a large degree that he came to believe in who he was and what he could do because he got this titanic amount of positive feedback from it. He had crowds when he gave speeches. He ran for governor a couple of times, and although it was actually stolen from him, the governorship, but he got a lot of votes. He had these enormous crowds. I think his self-regard went over the moon. But at some point, that was no longer dependent on petty details like whether the goat gland operation actually technically worked. It didn't even matter anymore. He had transcended fact. Do you know what I mean? He was in higher ether where all things were all right. Because whatever he said was true. It's like he stood on a platform. I remember at one time comparing himself to Christ, flinging his arms wide, and more than once compared himself to Christ. He really lifted off there as time went on.
He definitely knew what kind of audience he was speaking to.
Oh, absolutely. That Middle West fundamentalist. Bedrock kind of Christian crowd, yeah.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page, and today on the show we have Pope Brock. Joining us from Arlington, Massachusetts is the author of the book Charlatan, America's Most Dangerous Huckster, The Man Who Pursued Him, and the Age of Flim Flam. It was published by Three Rivers Press out of New York City, and It's a book that I've read recently, and in fact, the way that I got to know about this book, Pope, was by watching a YouTube video of yourself from C-SPAN 2 from several years ago. Somebody has uploaded that. And one time when I was looking up information about John R. Brinkley, you can find some on the internet, various kinds of information about him. One of the videos that I found was one of you, I think in Winnetka, Illinois, at a bookstore talking about the book probably after it was published. And I thought it was, very interesting because I hadn't really watched many videos about Brinkley. There are a couple, but at that point I hadn't watched any. And that's when I looked up the book and got a chance to read it. And I must say, for everyone who may be listening out there, that the story is fascinating. But one of the nice things about the book is that is told. The story of Brinkley is told in a very swift style, really knowledgeable. You can tell that the author, in this case Pope Brock, has really done his research, and that's why I was asking you before about how hard it was to do this research. Did you get to interview any living person related to this saga of Dr. Brinkley?
Oh, well, let's see. A couple, but I was really catching at the skirts of the people who actually participated. You know what I mean? Almost everyone who died I talked to. The widow of Brinkley's singing cowboy. I remember that picture. The guy with his
Roy Faulkner, hat. Is that right?
She was fun. She was very helpful. I interviewed Jeanette Carter of the Carter family. We haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the many things that Brinkley achieved kind of by accident in his life was to make the Carter family nationally known. He put them on his radio station and turned them from regional stars into a national attraction. So at that time, that was the Carter family being the three central members, AP and the two women. Oh God, whose name is
Sarah and Maybelle.
So they brought their children. And one of those kids, June Carter was one of them, it was that generation. Jeanette Carter was another. And she was still alive at the time, so I interviewed her down in Virginia. She was wonderful. She remembered him and singing for him, and she remembered her little sister, the youngest one, Anita, sleeping in a guitar case while they rehearsed and stuff. So it was great to get those little details. I mean, it wasn't a burden or a great chore or struggle getting the material. It was there are projects where it is, but in this case, it was just sort of one treasure trove after the next. I really enjoyed it. I was quite lucky that way.
What you mentioned about the Carter family takes me back to the actual reason why I first heard of John Brinkley, and it was many years ago when I bought some CDs, and I can't remember if it was R Hooley Records or if it was Rounder Records, but one of them put out a series of CDs of the Carter family live on border radio. And that's how I first heard of, the border stations like XER or XERA or XENT, which were blasting from the border of Mexico and the United States pretty much for a worldwide audience because of all the wattage that they had. Which really takes me to my next question, which has to do with the relationship between John Brinkley and the radio. How did he get the idea of starting a radio station? Because we have to think that we're talking about the 1920s. This is the infancy of radio broadcasting in America, and so this idea had to have come from somewhere.
Yes, this really was the infancy of radio. If I'm right, the first, you can probably tell me yourself whether I am or not. The first serious kind of national and regional broadcast was of the 1920 election returns out of Pittsburgh. I mean, it's something like that. It wasn't. That's really when, right around the time radio began, and Brinkley's station went up in 1923. I mean, that's so. It's a very small window. He got the idea because he was out in California scouting a better place to go because business was good, and he was hoping to move out to California and live in the sun and have this huge, glamorous clientele and so on. As it turned out, the California Medical Board had other ideas about that, so that never took place. However, he did, while he was out there, visit the offices of the Los Angeles Times, and the editor, Mr. Chandler, at that time, had just set up a radio station in L.A. there, and Brinkley saw that, and the scales fell from his eyes. He realized what he could do, and he ran back to Kansas and built one of his own.
And that's how it started. And the station that he started was KFKB, Kansas First, Kansas Best. And I think one interesting thing about this, and one of the reasons why this has interested me so much over the years, is one, if we think about the infancy of radio broadcasting in America, and in the world for that matter, then we have to think that what we now know as radio had nothing to do with what radio was like in the 1920s and those early years. What kind of radio station did Brinkley have in Kansas?
Well, this was one more aspect of his genius, because in those first years, people got on the radio, and they were, as in general, the announcers and so forth, the people who spoke on the radio, were every bit as bombastic as they'd been on the Chautauqua circuit or that school of oratory. Brinkley realized that he could sit at a microphone and talk in their soft, persuasive tones, free associate about the violets along the riverbank and all that sort of thing, and draw people in rather than blasting them backward. He was the sort of quack equivalent in this regard of someone I know you appreciate, Bing Crosby, being the man. I mean, he was the man, or one of the first to realize he revolutionized singing by singing personally, crooning right into the mic. I mean, isn't that accurate?
That's right. He was really one of the very first singers, one of the first crooners of the day in the late 20s, early 30s. Bing Crosby, who realized that he could use the microphone as an instrument and actually sing into the microphone instead of bellow into the microphone, and that made him incredibly popular, along with his, of course, the great songs that he sang and the jazzy style that he employed.
Sure. Yes. Well, Brinkley is an exact parallel to that, and he had a wonderful facility. He could sit at the microphone and just spin out these sort of pseudo parables and hard to kind of quasi religious visions of mother and
the days gone by and yesteryear.
And the days gone by that somehow all folded into when you were safe, when you were well fed, when you were healthy, and then it would kind of work its way into, wouldn't you like to be just that healthy now? And then he would, be folding in his pitches. He was really brilliant at it. Some of that audio still survives, and you can hear him weave his spell.
You know, at the same time that he did that, and he was soft-spoken, he was also quite an aggressive advertiser at a time when there was almost no advertisement on radio because it was not deemed a good thing back in the early days of radio, believe it or not, to use radio stations to very clearly advertise something and make a profit out of that. It was more of the idea of public service and that kind of thing. But one thing that's interesting also is that sometimes Brinkley would use on the radio certain sexually related language that would raise some eyebrows as well.
Sure. Well, yeah. And when did that ever cost anybody money? You know what I mean? So, you know, part of his appeal.
You mentioned that a lot of these, some of these broadcasts actually survive, some recordings of them, snippets of them. You can hear some on YouTube, for example. There's even a video, I think, of Dr. Brinkley when he was older, addressing the patients that you can find on YouTube. And I've listened to...
If I could just... I have some posted on my website, if you don't mind mentioning it.
No, sure. Please do, because... you know, I honestly was not aware of that, and it'll be great for me to be able to go and listen to them.
Yeah, there's several, and you can really get the flavor. The website being my name, so it's www.popebrock.com. That'll take you to it. There's a Brinkley section that's easy to find. So that's a quick way to get to that stuff.
Now, one can listen to them on your website, and you know, those surviving snippets and even a couple of videos where you can actually see Brinkley. One thing that's surprising is that one wonders, in many ways, with a 21st century perspective, how could people find these free association talks in this soft, almost crooning voice, so entertaining and so interesting. When heard today, his style sounds sort of like a drone. It might sound really even boring to present day listeners. To me, they're mesmerizing. They're fascinating.
Yeah.
But from a present day perspective of how radio and TV and everything has changed over the decades. They don't sound as fascinating today, maybe to the ears of today's listeners.
They sound old-fashioned compared to today. They are. But what's exactly the same as today is the psychology that they're working on, the ways of infiltrating the mind with spurious comparisons, false promises. It's done much more now with 1 second cuts and all the rest of it. But the purpose, the thinking behind it, is just the same. We are to state a truism. We are not one bit any more sophisticated about detecting or not falling to quacks to quacks' blandishments than we people were then.
Now, if Brinkley's business was booming in Milford, Kansas, and his radio station was extremely popular and it was heard all over the nation because, the wattage was not bad for KFKB. It was the sunshine station in the heart of the nation or something like that. I think that's the way it was advertised. Why did Brinkley decide to move to Mexico? Why did he have to move to Mexico if his business was so good up in Kansas?
Well, because he made a virtue of necessity, basically, because Morris Fishbein, our antagonist, was driving at Brinkley on two fronts. One was to get his medical license yanked, and the other was to get his radio license yanked. It was a two-front campaign, and as it came to pass, both campaigns were successful at about the same time, around 1930. So Brinkley was suddenly without an ability to practice, and his megaphone had been taken away. Now, a lot of people would have folded up at that point, but then he has this brainwave that he could go to Mexico and with one fell swoop solve both of his problems. He could practice medicine, and he could get his he could build an even bigger radio station. So he goes hustling down to Mexico City with a big suitcase full of cash. He basically hands it directly to the president of Mexico, and goes to work. As it turned out, he got a license to practice medicine in Texas. The whole operation was much more balkanized at that time, the licensing process. So what he could no longer do in the Midwest, he could do in Texas. So he's he's in Del Rio, which is just across the river. So he's bouncing back and forth between Mexico and Del Rio, and he is doing better than ever.
Well, he also builds a station, and I think the first one he built was XER. And he actually went all out for this. We're talking about the early days, again, of radio broadcasting, when there were not as many regulations as we have right now, where most American stations in the United States had at best 50,000 watts, like WLS in Chicago, WSB in Atlanta, WSM in Nashville, which carried the Grand Ole Opry, was a 50,000 watt station. Well, Brinkley went all out. First 100,000, then 500,000, then even 1 million watts. That's almost unthinkable. I mean, 1 million watts. I mean, it's even today. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. I've heard or I've read somebody describing this border blasters as the internet of its time.
That's fair.
Because of the wide reach of the signal. It could be heard not only in all of the United States and interfering with all of the other stations, but also as far away as Finland and Australia and New Zealand and the West Indies. I mean, this is one way in which Brinkley was a broadcasting innovator, a visionary in a way.
Yeah.
In what other ways was he a broadcasting innovator?
Well, he just first of all about Mexico and setting up that station there. There were really two things that enabled him to operate there. One was the money, just a straight out bribes. The other thing he had going for him was that Mexico, the Mexican government, had a big grudge against the United States and Canada around the whole idea of radio, because when radio sort of materialized and they saw the spectrum, and so they began assigning broadcast bands. The United States being the 500-pound gorilla there, they set it up, and then Canada got some, and they basically worked it out between themselves. They left Mexico completely out of it, and Mexico was pissed, justifiably, right? So they were more than happy to have Brinkley and run up 1 million watts, and just a big finger in the sky to the U.S. Do you know what I mean? So that's part of what was going on.
But then he realized that, and that had already happened in Kansas on KFKB, but he could use music as a way to lure his clients as well.
Well, yes, I mean, that begins to speak to the question you were really asking. He understood that as seductive as he could be on the air, he couldn't possibly expect people to just cling to his ear like that all the time. So he became the sort of Ed Sullivan of that period in terms of bringing all kinds of different acts on, and music, of course, lots of music, but also fortune tellers and aliens and whatever. I mean, there was some really, really crazy people got behind the microphone, and as the other stations went on, there just became this kind of competition about how crazy these people on the air could get. Many of whom were now getting chased out of the U.S. and so the border blaster was their natural home. So it becomes this. I think of it as kind of the forerunner, ultimately, of AM radio. Mm-hmm. You know, it had that kind of energy, that kind of salesmanship, that kind of God knows what's going to happen next. And which is why, as I said, Wolfman Jack eventually wound up in Brinkley's chair sometime after Brinkley's death, and there's a reason why he was sitting there. Do you know what I mean?
It's also the beginning of regulation, really, because if all of these fortune tellers and soothsayers were pushed off the airwaves in the United States and had to go to the border, that's because there were already some efforts going on in the direction of trying to regulate the American airwaves.
Yes, already there was a flat prohibition against preachers soliciting money on the air. We can imagine how that went down with a number of preachers. They go to Mexico and they don't have that problem anymore, you know. So there was a whole generation of blood and thunder kind of men of God, you know, who went down there and started to make piles of their own.
In this respect, there was a specific show that Brinkley was doing, which was sort of a genius idea at first, but it would turn against him. Was a show called Medical Question Box.
Yes, that was
already in Kansas.
That was earlier. Yeah, that was back in the Kansas days. It's part of what contributed to getting his license taken away in the first place. He invited listeners to write in their complaints, you know, describe their ailments, and he would prescribe for them over the air. This necessitated no visit to the doctor, no actual physical contact or visual contact of any kind. He supplemented this idea with striking a deal with a whole network of pharmacies in the Midwest to sell his mysterious ointments and salves and creams and so on. His remedies then for anything that people wrote in about was Formula 65, whatever it was. You know, just go buy that. Rub it on yourself for 6 months and you'll be fine. You know what I mean? So it was this huge other moneymaker he had going on. This got him into a world of trouble, not because of the kind of frightful ethics of it, but because he was taking business away from other doctors. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it was a monetary motivation among thousands of doctors who banded together, say, this guy has to be stopped. He's ruining our business. And that had a lot to do with how Fishbein was able to get the muscle to get Brinkley's license taken away.
Not to mention that he was also selling these alleged remedies that in many cases were useless at 6 times the price.
Yeah, right, exactly. Mystery ingredients, 6 times the price, yeah.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page. This is Anton Garcia Fernandez talking to you from the state of Tennessee, and up in Arlington, Massachusetts, we're being joined by Pope Brock, who's read this really interesting and really fascinating book called Charlatan, America's Most Dangerous Huckster, The Man Who Pursued Him, and the Age of Flim Flam. This was published a few years ago by Three Rivers Press in New York. Of course, this most dangerous huckster is Dr. John R. Brinkley, and the man who pursued him is Dr. Morris Fishbein of the M.A. In 1930, or around 1930, Pope, when the medical license and the broadcasting license were revoked, the ones that Dr. Brinkley had, he decided to run for the governorship of Kansas. Now, this is interesting, not only because he was trying to do this in order to avoid all these problems that he was having, all these legal problems, but also because during the campaigns he revealed himself to be an innovator also in the field of political campaigns.
Yes.
What kinds of things was he doing that were unheard of in the 1930s in order to try and win the governorship of the Sunflower State?
Well, one of the things he did was invent the sound truck. Huey Long had something called a sound truck in 28, I believe, but it sat wherever it was and just broadcast. It might have been as well been from a building. It was Brinkley's idea to put loudspeakers on top of the truck and just send it through the streets, like an ice cream man. Mm-hmm. This was, people ran out of their houses. It was like the voice of God. What's happening? It wasn't just what was coming out of the speakers, but the fact that there were speakers that got it all, got him all so talked about. So that was huge. He also he bought an airplane from Lindbergh and used it as a campaign plane. So he was puddle jumping from place to place to place. Could put him in far more places than anyone had ever thought of reaching during a political campaign. So, I mean, it was, those are big ideas, and they have lasted, as you know.
But they were not obviously put into practice by anybody but Brinkley back in those days. The intelligence of this man when it came to selling himself and selling his schemes was fantastic. He was far ahead of his time in the field of advertising and using the mass media, the fledgling really mass media, in order to achieve a certain goal. However, in this case, he did not achieve the goal. He was not successful in bidding for the governorship of Kansas the first time around, and also the second time around. What happened?
Well, the first time around was really his moment. Or should have been. He joined the campaign very late. It was right after his licenses were taken away. He turned around and said, "You know what? I'm running for governor." This was a couple of months before the election, which meant that he was going to have to go in as a write-in candidate. Mm-hmm. That alone would have discouraged most people. It didn't discourage him. He is zooming around, getting all this attention. These people he's drawing all these crowds. The establishment back in Topeka said, what are we going to do here? We're going to stop this guy. So days before the election, they get together, the council, whatever, city council, somebody who was involved. The state legal system in some way, I don't remember exactly. In any case, this regulation was put forth whereby his name written on the ballot would not count unless it was written a very specific way. John R. Brinkley. Everything and all of that had to be perfectly spelled. So if anybody put in Dr. Brinkley, Doc Brinkley, left out the E, and you understand the kind of the electorate that we're talking about, impassioned, but not necessarily college educated, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was just this impossible standard. So although Brinkley ran around and he tried to generate these chants, about how they spell it this way, that's what doomed him, because thousands and thousands and thousands of ballots were thrown out on these egregious technicalities. He would have taken the governorship, but he was prevented by that.
And that it is understandable that it would be difficult to win an election at such short notice, but he came really close, and had they not changed the rules, he most definitely would have won that election. Now, the second time around, as I was reading the book, I was fascinated by the fact that something must have changed in the electorate in just a couple of years or so. And a few years down the road, he tried again, and he didn't even come close. What factors do you think factored into this second loss when, he still used the same sort of ideas? He still had the mouthpiece of his huge radio station, and still he couldn't make it to the governor's mansion.
Well, yes. A couple of things. The first time around, he had all the energy of a wronged man. He had just all of his all the licenses that had been pulled away. It had just happened. It was this fresh outrage. There was nothing like that to help motivate people. The other thing was that he moved away when he got when he had to leave Kansas in order to continue his medical practice. He moved down to Texas. He tried to maintain a sort of toehold in Kansas, but out of sight, out of mind. So he was he had his moment, but there was only one.
I see. Well, that is that's one of the things that I really was the most surprised about, was that second loss. But it really, in many ways, did not faze him. He kept at it the same way. He stayed, true to his idea, money-making schemes, radio broadcasting. He turned Del Rio, Texas into Hillbilly Hollywood, as it was called, at some point, attracting all this talent, not just the Carter family, but also other early country music stars like Cowboy Slim Reinhardt, people like even Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman, seems to have sung over his radio station. But despite all of this, despite the fact that he was living the high life, he was traveling the world to the South Seas on ocean liners. In one specific case, Fishbein and Brinkley actually met on board of one of those ocean liners.
Yes.
That's kind of an interesting story that you really describe really well in the book, and I think people should read the book to find out exactly what happened. But what are the odds that the two of them would be on the same ship on their way back to the United States at that point?
Well, not great, but on the other hand, not infinitesimal. Them both being they're both being men of wealth, prosperity, and who made trips to Europe on a fairly regular basis there for a while, either for pleasure or to lecture, which is what Fishbein was doing. So they were moving in the same general orbit. The interesting thing about that meeting on the boat was really that Fishbein had become discouraged and distracted to an extent by that point with trying to bring down Brinkley. He had dozens of other quacks on his plate. It was actually seeing him in the flesh for the first time that sort of galvanized him, sort of brought him back, said, whoa, I've got to get this. And he got off the boat and really went to work. And that's what brought about the final catastrophe in terms of Brinkley's life.
I love that chapter where you describe in detail the incredible mansion that Dr. Brinkley had in Del Rio, Texas. That's another really interesting description that I really enjoyed reading. But despite this wealth that he had, there came a moment when the writing, so to speak, was on the wall and he would be taken down. What happened to Dr. Brinkley towards the end of his life that brought about the collapse of this amazing empire that he had been building over the years?
Well, he made the mistake of suing Fishbein for libel. That's it in a nutshell. Part of it was straight out hubris. I think at that point, Brinkley had grown so successful and self-confident that it didn't occur to him that a bug like Fishbein could actually do him any harm. So part of it was to defend his reputation. Part of it was the publicity of it. Part of it was just, at that point, he considered himself invincible. So he sues for libel, puts himself in court. What that means is that then he has to defend his practices on the stand. That didn't entirely penetrate into his mind, I think, sufficiently before he began his action. But it was that trial, which was really dramatic, where he was picked apart, really, piece by piece, and the judgment was found against him, that he was declared in flat language to be a quack and humiliated, at which point all these people now are suing him, past patients and whatnot, people who had been harmed, physically damaged by him, all these people who, because of the great publicity surrounding him, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the backing, they didn't have the courage to try to fight him. But once there was a kind of once he was down, this kind of pack mentality developed, this kind of broad revenge. He had killed people. I mean, there were at least 4 dozen people that he was responsible for killing on the table. That's completely apart from how many he maimed or financially ruined or all the rest of it. I mean, he was, for all our talk about what a wonderful innovator he is, or he was, which is absolutely the truth, he was also soulless to an extraordinary degree. So when you lifted up the rock, he had a bad record, and he made the mistake of exposing it.
And those chapters you devote to that final trial are absolutely captivating. A lot of the questions and answers, and the way the different attorneys engaged with him and with all the other witnesses and the judge. I mean, that really, that's really, not that the rest of the book isn't, which it is too, but that's really a page-turner part of the book. I must have read that in one afternoon.
Yeah.
But on page 148, you have a picture of Brinkley's third and last hospital, which was in Little Rock, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. Not really that far from where I'm at right now, in the whole scheme of things. And you say he later came to regret it, building that hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas. What do you mean exactly with that he later came to regret building that hospital in Arkansas?
Well, he got into a spat with the people in Del Rio, and it was he put himself into a comparative backwater, partially out of a snit. He brought himself down. It became harder to attract business. It was very expensive to put up a whole new operation. That's really why he realized he was going to have to essentially roll the rock back up the hill to some degree by completely relocating, that he'd been better off where he was.
You're listening to the voice of Pope Brock, joining us from Arlington, Massachusetts. This is a new episode of the Written Page, and the book we're talking about is called Charlatan, America's Most Dangerous Huckster. That's R Brinkley. The Man Who Pursued Him, Dr. Morris Fishbein, and The Age of Flim Flam, talking about the 1920s and 1930s, the infancy of radio broadcasting. And as we wind down this episode of the podcast, Pope, there's a couple more things that I would like to ask you before we finish, and I don't want to forget, because we talk about Dr. Brinkley, John Brinkley, and there's a couple other things we have to talk about. Dr. Brinkley had two wives. The first wife he married really early on and divorced after just a few years, but his second wife, Minnie Brinkley, she seems to be an important part of this story as well, don't you think?
Yes, I do, and that's an intriguing part about Brinkley and both of them, really, because it was apparently a love match. I sat around and tried to imagine my way into that from various angles, and I never totally succeeded, but that is apparently the way it was. What was nefarious about it was that Minnie was his right hand in all of this skullduggery that he perpetrated. She was the one with the clipboard, welcoming people in, hosing them in various ways, persuading them to take these operations when they were hesitant, strong-arming them when they were still half doped up, stuff like that. She was right in there with him, but she had this wonderful, lovely face, and Brinkley used her as a sort of prop. I mean, there's a promotional film where he's sitting there talking about he's surrounded by flowers and talking about how if Mrs. Brinkley lived near you, she would be right around with a plate of chocolate chip cookies, that sort of stuff. And then she would appear, she would the same way. They had a son, small son, and he would put the little boy, set him in front of the microphone and get him to say hello, to the suckers. Not that he didn't say hello suckers, you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But the family was definitely, it was like a three hooked operation.
And Johnny Boy, that's the son of Dr. Brinkley and Minnie Brinkley. Apparently it took him a long time to actually conceive, which is kind of, interesting in a way, ironic in a way, right?
Yeah.
But somebody in the book, an old, acquaintance of Johnny Boy describes him as one of the saddest people that he's ever met. So Johnny Boy did not have a very good life in spite of all the money that Dr. Brinkley had and all the presents that he probably bestowed on him.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and that is the reason lies in that description of yours. He was pampered. He was indulged. He had a bodyguard going back and forth with him to school. He was mocked, ruthlessly by his schoolmates. And then as he got older and he realized the kind of father he had, the kind of cloud that the father was under, it became very, very oppressive, and he couldn't escape from it. So he wound up taking his own life.
Because of all the lawsuits and stuff that happened towards the very end of his life, in the early 1940s, Dr. Brinkley died, it is said, nearly penniless. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. Because his assets had been sucked up pretty fast by all the people suing him and by his legal expenses. You put the two of those together, and he was bankrupt in a hurry. Yeah.
His wife, however, lived into the 1970s, and she was convinced until the very end of her life that her husband, Dr. Brinkley, was way ahead of his time. It's a very interesting quote towards the very end of the book, where she is comparing this goat gland operation to organ transplants.
Yes, right, exactly. Pioneer of organ transplants. Yeah, and they were still doing the goat gland operation somewhere. She said, but they were doing it in secret, and so But yeah, she kept boosting him right toward the end, right to the end. But and she's still living in the mansion, which is essentially crumbling around her. It's like a Miss Havisham kind of scene at the end.
Of course, the style of Dr. Brinkley and his business model, so to speak, spawned a group of imitators. For example, Norman G. Baker, who pretty much shadowed Dr. Brinkley throughout his life and went pretty much wherever Dr. Brinkley went, and tried to to take some of his business. Also started his own border blaster station. Any interest in maybe in the future writing about any more of these quacks, or is quackery over for you, Pop?
Oh, I think I'd probably said my piece about quackery. I mean, when you've had the best, there's a lot of other great stuff out in the world. Before we part, can I just mention that that interest in this book of mine was actually revived last year by a documentary that was more or less inspired by it, I guess. But it's called Nuts, N-U-T-S exclamation point, directed by Penny Lane. Mm-hmm. It won a prize at the Sundance Film Festival, and it's a great movie. It's not only a great way into the whole world of Brinkley, but she did wonderful things. She hired 6 different animators. Along with all the she has historical footage and all the usual bells and whistles of that kind of movie, but she also has these 6 animators, and she uses them she changes them off more or less to track his way through life. It's so visually it's a very interesting movie. So I recommend it to anybody who has any further interest at all in this topic.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Pope, because doing the research for the interview, I chanced upon that movie. I haven't been able to watch it yet, but it's definitely on my watch list. I definitely want to watch that. Again, the title is Nuts, N-U-T-S, and an exclamation point, and the director is Penny Lane. I definitely will check that one out because, as you know, I'm interested in the topic, and I've read all the books about this topic. There are a few other books, but none are as detailed about Dr. Brinkley as the one that Pope Brock has written. I would like to mention also before we finish that you, Pope, host a radio show that can be heard online, and also if you live in the Maine area, you can listen to it on regular radio. Now the show, as far as I know, is called Dog's Dinner on a community radio station in Maine, and it is not in any way, as far as I know, about quacks.
It is not. It is not indeed. It is not indeed. No, it's just music. But I suppose in some small way, I've inherited his mantle, like a lot of other people.
Can you tell us where that show could be heard?
Yes, of course. Thanks. It's the station is WMPG. It operates out of Portland, Maine, and it is 90.9 on the FM dial. And it streams WMPG.org. I'm on Wednesday nights from 8:30 to 10. There's lots of other great programming there. It's a really solid and innovative community radio station. So I'm sure everybody has plenty to listen to as it is. But I pass that along for what it's worth.
I've heard it a couple of times, and it's got a very interesting, really eclectic mix of music from all over the place, all different styles, and it's got a lot of jazz, which I really and truly appreciate. Again, it's called Dog's Dinner on station WMPG. You can hear it online as well. out of Portland, Maine, and it's on Wednesday nights from 8:30 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Pope, my final question is this. Do you see any examples of present-day activities that echo those of Brinkley? Or is Dr. Brinkley a thing of the past? Are we over all this quackery, or is any of this still to be seen in the present day?
Oh my God!
You don't have to give specific examples. Don't worry about it. But is this something that when we read the book we can think, well, this is over. There's no more of this. This was back in the 20s. This was back in the 30s. Or has this survived in any way?
It has survived 100%, at least 100%. It has, if anything, it's been given an accelerant by all the technology there is today. It has not made people any more sophisticated, and a lot of the charlatans, quacks, whatever, out there on a medical, medicinal kind of that level, operate in these little cubby holes where they're never seen. They can hop from place to place. I mean, they don't ask to be famous. They just ask to make a lot of money. So there are a million more scams out there than there ever were. And Anton, you can cut this part out, okay, if you want. But I just can I mention Trump?
Can you what?
Can I mention Trump?
Oh, yeah, of course you can mention Trump. There's absolutely no problem about that.
Oh, okay. because again, the sales of this book have jumped in part because of stories comparing it. There was one in the New York Times just 4 or 5 days ago with what we can learn about Trump from the history of charlatans. I mean, it's they're the characteristics of a snake oil salesman and Donald Trump line up. And I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody out there, but such is the case. They line up just point right down right down the track. He is a fantastic manipulator and bamboozler, if there was one. So, in that regard, we are, I would say, smothered in quackery at this very moment.
And in that regard, the book is just as important for the present day. You can read it not only as history, but also as the history that not only can, but does repeat itself. I told you before we began our conversation that, we could go with the conversation wherever it took us. So, one of the things that I like to do, in as much as I don't really make any money off of these shows, is to just allow people to express themselves and then, say whatever they feel like. I must say, however, that I didn't know you were going to mention that, but as I was reading this book, that name came to mind.
Okay.
More than once, so absolutely no problem at all in mentioning it, as other things, not necessarily related, came to mind. But this idea of the goat glands and the rejuvenation and all of that, especially bearing in mind we're talking about the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazi regime also comes to mind when we think about people like Dr. Brinkley, not to mention that other quacks, radio quacks, border blaster quacks around the same time, like Norman Baker, were very clearly anti-Semitic and I would even say pro-Nazi.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Brinkley he took a trip to Germany in the 30s and came back and installed little swastikas in the tile around his pool. So he became quite a fan.
For more information about that or anything else regarding the life, the incredible, the unbelievable life of this charlatan by the name of John R. Brinkley, you should read this book, Charlatan, America's Most Dangerous Huckster, The Man Who Pursued Him, and the Age of Flim Flam. published by Three Rivers Press, and the author has joined us for the past, hour and about 15 minutes or so. It's funny how fast time goes when you're having fun, and I really had a great time. Pope Brock was our guest on this new edition of The Written Page. Pope, thank you so much for writing this book, first of all, but also for taking the time to sit down to chat with me on this edition of The Written Page.
Thanks, Anton. I really appreciate the opportunity.
This has been a new edition of The Written Page, a podcast hosted by Anton Garcia Fernandez, and it will be published very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Mine is the copyright year 2018, and the podcast was recorded live from the small town of Martin in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. Again, the book is Charlatan by Pope Brock. Thank you so much for your interest, and, let's keep reading interesting books like this, and let's keep listening to the podcasts on Anton GF, the YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Signing off the air now. Thanks again.